I built the $3.8 billion Atlas system that ran Cobecale Energy for 17 years. My wife's dad fired me in front of the entire board. Cobecale is a rocket ship, and we don't have room for anchors, he said, throwing my 50-page risk report in the trash. I nodded quietly and let security escort me out. Tomorrow's gonna be fun. My name's Adrian Holt, and if there's one thing you should know about me right off the bat, it's this. I don't build toys, I don't mess around with half-baked ideas, and I sure as hell don't waste 17 years of my life creating something that's just pretty good. No, I build empires that run themselves, systems so elegant and so brutally efficient that they could operate in their sleep while their creators sip overpriced coffee and pretend to care about quarterly earnings reports. For 17 long, grueling, occasionally soul-crushing years, I was the brain, the backbone, and the beating heart behind Atlas, a $3.8 billion AI system that managed every single contract, every compliance check, every financial heartbeat, and every microscopic transaction that kept Cobecale Energy from collapsing into a heap of legal violations and bankruptcy filings. Atlas wasn't just software. It was art. It was poetry written in Python and C++, and it was the only reason this company hadn't been sued into oblivion by every regulatory agency from here to Brussels. But then came Gerald Kale, my father-in-law and the company's self-appointed space commander, cosmic visionary, and professional motivational poster come to life, who decided one Tuesday morning that I was an anchor holding back his precious rocket ship. Yeah, you heard that right. An anchor. Me. The guy who literally kept the engines running while he was out there giving TED Talks about disrupting the energy paradigm and posting LinkedIn selfies with captions like, "Dream bigger, hustle harder, synergize vertically." I'm pretty sure Gerald thinks vertical synergy is an actual thing and not just what happens when you throw darts at a corporate jargon board after 3 martinis. The boardroom that particular morning smelled like burnt coffee, stale bagels, and the unmistakable scent of fear mixed with overpriced cologne. I walked in carrying a 50-page risk report, meticulously researched, footnoted, cross-referenced, and backed by enough data to make a statistics professor weep with joy. It detailed every single red flag, every potential landmine, and every catastrophic legal consequence of the pending merger Gerald was so excited about. This wasn't some vague, I have a bad feeling kind of document. This was basic math, cold hard numbers, the kind of stuff that should make any rational human being pump the brakes and maybe, I don't know, consult an actual expert before driving the company off a cliff. I dropped that report on the polished mahogany table with a satisfying thud, the kind of sound that says, "Pay attention, this matters." Gerald barely glanced at it. He picked it up like it was a takeout menu he didn't order, flipped through maybe 3 pages with the attention span of a goldfish on Red Bull, and then, I kid you not, he laughed. Not a polite chuckle, not a nervous, interesting laugh, but a full-blown, condescending, "Oh, you poor paranoid little man," laugh that echoed off the walls and made everyone else in the room shift uncomfortably in their ergonomic chairs. "Adrian," he said, still grinning like he'd just heard the world's funniest knock-knock joke. "This is paranoia. Pure, unfiltered paranoia. We're building a rocket ship here, buddy, and you're over here worried about seat belts and fire extinguishers." He tossed my report in the trash can next to his chair, the same trash can where someone had thrown away a banana peel and a crumpled napkin, and let it sit there like it was no different from yesterday's lunch garbage. "We don't need anchors, Adrian. We need visionaries. We need people who can see the future, not people who are stuck in spreadsheets and worst-case scenarios." I nodded slowly, keeping my face perfectly neutral, adjusted my tie, and thought to myself with the kind of calm clarity that only comes when you know you're about to watch someone learn a very expensive lesson. "Perfect. Let's see how your rocket flies without the engine, Gerald. Let's see how far you get when the guy who built the entire navigation system, fuel management protocol, and emergency landing sequence isn't around to keep your shiny little spacecraft from exploding on the launch pad." Security showed up about 3 minutes later, 2 guys in matching blazers who looked like they'd rather be literally anywhere else, flanking me on each side like I was some kind of corporate criminal being perp-walked out of a crime scene. They didn't say much, just the usual, "We need you to come with us" routine, and I didn't resist because honestly, what was the point? I'd already seen this coming from a mile away. As they escorted me down the hallway past the open plan office where my former colleagues suddenly became very interested in their computer screens, I waved at the receptionist, gave her my best casual Friday smile, the kind that says, "Hey, no hard feelings, just another Tuesday." And she looked at me like I'd just told her the building was on fire. I walked out those glass doors, felt the cool autumn air hit my face, and made myself a promise right then and there, standing on the sidewalk, while some junior analyst nervously avoided eye contact as he scurried past me. Tomorrow was going to be very, very fun. Not fun in the let's grab drinks and laugh about old times kind of way, but fun in the let's watch a self-important CEO realize he just fired the only person who knew where all the bodies were buried kind of way. Gerald wanted a rocket ship? Fine. He was about to learn that rocket ships don't fly without engineers, and engines don't run without the people who built them. I got into my car, turned on some jazz because I'm classy like that, and drove home with the windows down, letting the wind mess up my hair, because honestly, who cared anymore? I wasn't an employee. I wasn't bound by non-competes or corporate politeness or the need to pretend Gerald's ideas made sense. I was free, and freedom, as it turns out, tastes a lot like revenge served cold with a side of "I told you so." My phone was already buzzing with texts from colleagues, some sympathetic, some confused, some probably just nosy, but I ignored them all. There'd be time for explanations later, time for the whole story to come out, time for everyone to realize what had actually just happened in that boardroom. For now, I just drove, smiled to myself, and started mentally preparing for phase 2 of a plan I'd put in place years ago, back when I first realized that Gerald Kale was the kind of man who'd rather look visionary than be competent. Some people learn from their mistakes. Some people learn from other people's mistakes. And then there's Gerald, who apparently needed to learn from a full-scale corporate meltdown orchestrated by the son-in-law he just threw away like trash. Tomorrow morning, the real fun would begin, and I couldn't wait to watch it unfold from the comfort of my living room, probably in pajamas, definitely with good tea, absolutely with the kind of satisfaction that only comes from being right when everyone else thought you were crazy. They call me an anchor. Fair enough. But anchors don't just hold things down. They also keep ships from drifting into rocks and sinking to the bottom of the ocean. Gerald was about to find out which one his company was heading for, and spoiler alert, it wasn't going to be a smooth journey. That night, after the world's most awkward car ride home where I listened to smooth jazz and contemplated the beautiful chaos I was about to unleash, I walked into my house and did what any recently unemployed tech genius would do. I brewed my favorite Darjeeling silver leaf tea, the good kind that costs more per ounce than most people's lunch, not the sad office kitchen tea bag flavor of despair that tastes like disappointment and broken dreams steeped in lukewarm water. This was the premium stuff, loose leaf, imported, the kind of tea that makes you feel like you've got your life together even when you've just been escorted out of your own company by security guards who looked more uncomfortable than you did. My wife, Melissa, was sitting on the couch in our absurdly expensive living room that her father had helped us invest in, which was code for, "I bought you this house, so you'd feel obligated to worship me forever." She was doing that thing where she pretended to be absorbed in her phone, but was actually avoiding eye contact like I had suddenly developed a contagious disease. Her thumb scrolled through Pinterest with the kind of aggressive focus that only comes when you're trying very hard not to talk about the elephant in the room, or in this case, the fired husband making tea in the kitchen. I could see her screen from where I stood. Vision boards, manifesting abundance, 10 ways to stay positive when life gets hard. And my personal favorite, how to support your spouse during career transitions, which she clearly wasn't reading because supporting me would require acknowledging my existence. Her dad was her hero, the man who gave me a job 17 years ago when I was fresh out of grad school with more student debt than common sense. And apparently, he'd also given himself permission to humiliate me whenever he felt like it. In Melissa's world, Gerald could do no wrong. He was the successful CEO, the self-made billionaire, the guy who turned a regional energy company into a national powerhouse. And I was just the tech guy, the behind-the-scenes person, the one who made sure the lights stayed on while Gerald took all the credit and the magazine covers. While she scrolled through her digital fantasy land of perfect homes and motivational quotes, I scrolled through something infinitely more important on my encrypted tablet, the one I kept in my study that she thought I used for boring work stuff, and probably video games or something. The app was called Covenant, and let me tell you, it wasn't available in any app store, didn't have a cute icon, and definitely wasn't going to help me manifest my dreams unless my dreams involved corporate espionage and righteous revenge. See, here's the thing that Gerald and his merry band of business school graduates never bothered to understand. Atlas wasn't just software. It wasn't just some program you install, update once a year, and forget about until it crashes during a crucial presentation. Atlas was a living, breathing organism, wired into every single department of Cobecale Energy like a nervous system, connecting everything from payroll to procurement, from compliance to contracts, from the CEO's calendar to the janitor's supply orders. It saw everything, knew everything, and remembered everything. And I had built it with one very special, very secret line of code that only I knew existed, buried so deep in the system architecture that you'd need a PhD in computer science and about 6 months of free time to even find it, let alone understand what it did. I called it the Covenant Protocol because I'm dramatic like that, and also because it sounded way cooler than emergency revenge subroutine or the Gerald is an idiot failsafe. The protocol was elegant in its simplicity. If the system detected my termination without a proper 2/3 board vote, not just Gerald throwing a tantrum and calling security, but an actual legitimate vote following proper corporate governance procedures, Atlas would interpret my firing as an act of corporate treason, a hostile takeover, a cyber attack from within. And within 24 hours of detecting this unauthorized termination, it would trigger a lockdown sequence that would make Fort Knox look like a public library. The beauty of it was that I designed this failsafe years ago, back when I first started noticing that Gerald treated the company like his personal playground and employees like disposable action figures. I'd buried the code in a routine system update, disguised it as a security enhancement, got it approved by the board who didn't bother reading the technical specifications because, let's be honest, most board members think coding is something you do with secret messages and decoder rings. Nobody knew it existed except me, and now, sitting in my kitchen with my fancy tea and my encrypted tablet, I was about to activate it. Melissa finally looked up from her phone, her perfectly highlighted hair catching the light from the chandelier her father bought us, and asked with the kind of forced casualness that screamed, "I'm trying to act normal, but I'm actually freaking out. What are you working on?" Her eyes darted to my tablet, and then back to my face, trying to read my expression like I was a book written in a language she didn't quite speak. "Just cleaning up some files," I said, giving her my most innocent smile, the one I used when I wanted to seem harmless and slightly boring, like I was organizing vacation photos or deleting old emails. She didn't know that those files I was cleaning up were about to flip her father's multi-billion-dollar empire upside down, shake it like a snow globe, and watch all the dirty secrets fall out like confetti at the world's worst party. She didn't know that in approximately 18 hours, her father was going to have the worst day of his professional life, and it was going to be entirely his own fault for throwing away the one person who actually understood how his company worked. I took another sip of my tea, savoring the delicate flavor, the subtle notes of muscatel and honey, and pulled up the Covenant interface on my tablet. The screen glowed softly in the dimming light of our kitchen, lines of code scrolling past like poetry, like a beautiful symphony of ones and zeros that were about to conduct the most spectacular corporate takedown this industry had ever seen. I'd tested this protocol 100 times in isolated environments, run every simulation, checked every possible outcome, and I knew exactly what would happen when I pressed that execute button. Atlas would lock down. Every high-level administrative account would be frozen. Every financial transaction would halt mid-process. Every contract would require my personal authorization to proceed. The company would effectively be paralyzed, unable to pay vendors, unable to process payroll, unable to do anything except sit there and realize that maybe, just maybe, firing your lead systems architect without a proper termination process was a spectacularly bad idea. Melissa went back to her phone, apparently satisfied with my boring explanation, and I went back to my tablet, reading through the protocol one more time, not because I needed to check it, but because I wanted to savor this moment, this calm before the storm, this last peaceful evening before I turned Gerald's world into a living nightmare of frozen accounts and panicked phone calls. The Covenant protocol wasn't about revenge, not really. though I'd be lying if I said that wasn't a delicious side benefit. It was about accountability. It was about showing everyone what happens when you treat people like disposable resources instead of human beings. It was about proving that you can't just fire the person who built your entire infrastructure and expect everything to keep running smoothly. It was about teaching Gerald Kale a lesson he should have learned in business school, but apparently skipped because he was too busy practicing his visionary speeches in the mirror. I finished my tea, rinsed the cup in the sink like a civilized human being, and headed to my study with my tablet tucked under my arm. Melissa called out something about dinner, probably asking if I wanted to order takeout since neither of us felt like cooking after the day we'd had, but I barely heard her. My mind was already racing ahead to tomorrow morning, imagining the chaos, the confusion, the absolute beautiful pandemonium that was about to erupt in that pristine glass tower where I'd spent 17 years of my life. As I closed the study door behind me and sat down at my desk, I whispered to myself, to the empty room, to Atlas somewhere out there in the digital ether waiting for my command. Let's see your rocket fly now, Dad. And then I smiled, the kind of smile that probably would have worried Melissa if she could see it, and started preparing to press the button that would change everything. Let's take a moment to really talk about Gerald Kale, because honestly, the man deserves his own chapter dedicated to the art of sounding important while saying absolutely nothing of substance. Imagine if Buzzword Bingo had a human form, grew legs, put on a $3,000 suit, and decided to run a Fortune 500 company. That's Gerald. The man could turn a simple yes or no question into a 15-minute TED Talk about synergizing our core competencies and leveraging our strategic assets in the marketplace of tomorrow. He loved, and I mean absolutely loved, saying things like, we need to actionize our deliverables and maximize our synergies across all vertical touchpoints while maintaining our forward momentum paradigm shift. I swear to God, he said that in a meeting once, and 3 people actually nodded like it meant something. Translation for those of us living in reality. I have no idea what I'm talking about, but it sounds expensive, important, and vaguely scientific, so everyone will assume I'm a genius instead of calling me out for speaking complete nonsense. Gerald surrounded himself with a team of professional hype men, guys who made their living by inventing job titles that sounded impressive but meant absolutely nothing. We had a chief visionary officer whose job, as far as I could tell, consisted of walking around with a tablet showing everyone graphs that trended upward regardless of what they were measuring. We had an innovation evangelist who spent most of his time posting motivational quotes on the company's internal social network and organizing trust fall exercises that nobody wanted to participate in. And my personal favorite, the crown jewel of useless corporate positions, the disruption architect, a guy named Brad who wore exclusively black turtlenecks, carried a Moleskine notebook everywhere, and claimed to be redesigning the conversation around energy consumption, when literally all he did was rename existing departments and call it innovation. None of these clowns, not a single one, could code their way out of a Wi-Fi login page. I'm not even exaggerating. I once watched the chief visionary officer spend 20 minutes trying to connect to the guest network because he couldn't figure out where to enter the password. This was the guy Gerald trusted to spearhead our digital transformation initiative. The same guy who thought the cloud was an actual cloud and asked me, in a meeting with investors, if we needed to worry about rain affecting our data storage. I wish I was making this up. Meanwhile, while these guys were busy disrupting paradigms and evangelizing innovation, I was in my office running actual simulations, crunching real numbers, and predicting billion-dollar lawsuits that were heading toward us like freight trains toward someone tied to the tracks. I had spreadsheets that would make a mathematician weep with joy, risk assessments that detailed every possible regulatory violation, and compliance reports that showed exactly how many laws we were about to break with this merger Gerald was so excited about. But sure, let's ignore the guy who actually knows what he's talking about and listen to Brad the disruption architect explain how we need to gamify our stakeholder engagement protocols. Gerald's favorite move, his signature technique that he pulled out whenever someone questioned his decisions, was what I called the motivational slideshow maneuver. He'd fire up PowerPoint, and I swear this presentation was always ready to go like he kept it bookmarked for emergencies, and he'd show us slide after slide of stock photos. Rockets launching into space. Mountains with people standing on top, raising their arms victoriously. bridges connecting impossible distances, oceans with sailboats cutting through waves. And every single slide had some inspirational quote in a font that was way too large. Things like, "The only limit is the one you set yourself," or "Dream bigger than your fears," or my absolute favorite, "Winners don't wait for permission to be great." And people ate it up. They actually sat there, grown adults with college degrees and mortgages, nodding along like Gerald had just revealed the secrets of the universe instead of showing them the corporate equivalent of a Pinterest board. Meanwhile, I'd be sitting in the back of the room calculating exactly how much money we were about to lose and wondering if anyone else in this conference room understood that rockets need fuel, engineering, and actual physics to fly, not just motivational quotes and good vibes. The thing that really got me, the part that made me want to scream into a pillow, was that Gerald genuinely believed he was a genius. He'd look at Atlas, this incredibly complex system that took me years to build, that required understanding machine learning, neural networks, database architecture, and about 17 different programming languages, and he'd say things like, "Yeah, Adrian built this, but really it was my vision that made it possible." His vision, like he'd done anything except sign the checks and take credit during press conferences. He'd introduce me at company events as our tech guy, like I was the person who fixed the printer when it jammed, not the person who built the entire digital infrastructure that kept this company from collapsing into legal chaos. And whenever something went wrong, whenever Atlas flagged a problem or I brought up a concern, Gerald would wave it off with some variation of, "That's just the risk of being disruptive," or "You can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs," which is great advice if you're making breakfast, but terrible advice if you're running a multi-billion-dollar corporation that's being investigated by 3 different regulatory agencies. But sure, Gerald, let's blame the guy who actually knew what a line of code looks like. Let's fire the person who spent 17 years making sure your rocket ship didn't explode on the launch pad. Let's toss his risk report in the trash and call him an anchor while you and your team of buzzword enthusiasts steer this company straight into an iceberg. That'll work out great. I'm sure Brad the disruption architect has a motivational quote ready for when the lawsuits start rolling in. By 9 o'clock in the morning, after I'd enjoyed a leisurely breakfast of scrambled eggs, toast with actual butter because I'm not some kind of animal who uses margarine, and a fresh pot of my favorite coffee, my phone started vibrating like a blender on high speed, like it was having some kind of electronic seizure, like every person who'd ever had my number suddenly remembered I existed and decided right now was the perfect time to reach out. The notifications were coming in so fast that my phone was practically doing a little dance across the kitchen counter, buzzing and dinging and lighting up with such enthusiasm that I half expected it to achieve sentience and start begging me to make it stop. My insider at IT, Leo Tran, a guy I'd mentored for years and who still had the good sense to stay loyal to the person who'd actually taught him useful skills rather than the CEO, who couldn't tell the difference between RAM and a random access memory joke, texted me at exactly 9:03 in the morning with a message that was somehow both panicked and delighted. Atlas rejecting all logins. Payments frozen. CFO just fainted. The message was followed by 3 skull emojis and 1 rocket emoji, which I appreciated because Leo understood both the gravity of the situation and the beautiful irony of Gerald's precious rocket ship metaphor coming back to haunt him in the most literal way possible. I could picture the scene perfectly, having spent enough time in that office to know exactly how this kind of chaos would unfold. The IT department, usually a quiet corner of the building where people spoke in hushed tones about server maintenance and software updates, would be in complete pandemonium right now. Every phone ringing off the hook, every desk surrounded by confused executives demanding to know why they couldn't access their accounts, why their passwords weren't working, why the system kept telling them authorization required. Contact System Administrator, which was hilarious because I was the system administrator and I was currently eating toast in my pajamas. By 9:15, just 12 minutes into this beautiful disaster, trading was halted on the New York Stock Exchange. Cobecale Energy's stock, which had been doing reasonably well despite Gerald's best efforts to run the company into the ground through sheer incompetence and buzzword addiction, suddenly froze mid-trading session. The automatic circuit breakers kicked in when the system detected unusual activity, which is stock market speak for something is very wrong and we need everyone to stop touching things until we figure out what's happening. I imagined traders staring at their screens in confusion, frantically calling their contacts at the company, getting nothing but busy signals and panicked receptionists who had no idea what to tell them. By 9:30, and this is where it got really good, where the schadenfreude reached levels that probably aren't healthy for normal human beings, but felt absolutely perfect to me. Melissa's father was on live television doing damage control. I switched on CNBC, that financial news channel that normal people ignore, but which becomes incredibly entertaining when your father-in-law is melting down on national television. And there he was, Gerald Kale, in all his expensive suited glory, standing outside the company headquarters with a microphone in his face, and that particular expression people get when they're trying very hard to look calm while internally screaming. He was trying, bless his delusional heart, to assure investors that everything was under control, that this was just a minor technical glitch, that the company's robust systems and dedicated IT team were working to resolve the issue, and that there was absolutely no cause for concern. His eye was twitching slightly, that little tell that I'd learned to recognize over the years of watching him lie his way through board meetings and investor calls, the tiny muscle spasm that said, I am absolutely panicking, but I'm going to smile through it, because that's what CEOs do. The reporter kept asking increasingly pointed questions about cybersecurity and whether this was a hack, and Gerald kept deflecting with corporate non-answers that meant absolutely nothing. Meanwhile, I was in my living room wearing the most comfortable pajamas I owned, the ones with little cartoons on them that Melissa had bought me as a joke gift, but which had turned out to be legitimately amazing, eating pancakes that I'd made from scratch, because apparently unemployment gave me time to actually cook proper breakfast instead of grabbing a granola bar on my way out the door. I was watching the chaos unfold like it was the season finale of my favorite show, except better because I'd written the script and directed every scene and knew exactly how it was going to end. The pancakes were perfect, fluffy and golden brown with just the right amount of maple syrup, the real expensive stuff from Vermont, not that fake corn syrup garbage, and I savored every bite while watching Gerald's empire crumble in real time on my television screen. This was what peak satisfaction looked like, what revenge tasted like when you cooked it low and slow over 17 years of preparation and planning and waiting for exactly the right moment to strike. When Melissa finally emerged from the bedroom, still in her robe and looking like she'd slept terribly, which was probably because her phone had also been blowing up with panic calls from her family, she turned on the news and gasped like someone had just told her the world was ending. Her hand flew to her mouth in that dramatic way people do when they're genuinely shocked, and she stared at the television screen where her father was sweating through his shirt on national television while trying to explain why his company had suddenly frozen like a computer from 1995. She turned to look at me, her eyes wide with that mixture of confusion and dawning realization, and asked in a voice that was trying very hard to sound casual, but came out sounding strangled and panicked. Adrian, did you have something to do with this? I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, the kind of sip that's more about making a point than actually drinking the beverage, and looked at her with the most innocent expression I could manage, which probably wasn't very convincing, but I didn't really care at this point. Sweetheart, I said, letting the word hang in the air for a moment. I'm unemployed. How could I possibly be this productive? Then I turned back to the television and took another bite of my pancakes while her father's stock price plummeted in the little ticker at the bottom of the screen. At 11:43 in the morning, right when I was considering whether to make myself a second pot of coffee or switch to tea, because I'm civilized like that and understand the importance of beverage variety throughout the day, my phone rang with a number I recognized immediately. It was Andrew Holtman, the head partner at Sterling & Pierce, one of those white shoe law firms with offices that look like they were decorated by someone who thought mahogany and leather were the only acceptable building materials and whose hourly rates could finance a small country's educational system. Andrew was the guy who managed the Kobe family trust, the same trust that held the controlling shares of the company, the same trust that Gerald thought he controlled, but actually didn't because his father had been way smarter than his son and had built in some very interesting safeguards that apparently nobody had bothered to read in detail. I let the phone ring twice before answering, not because I was playing hard to get, but because I was genuinely trying to decide if I wanted to have this conversation while sitting down or standing up, whether I should sound concerned or amused, whether I should pretend I had no idea what was happening or just skip straight to the part where I explained exactly how Gerald had screwed himself. I went with sitting down at my kitchen table with my coffee, because comfort is important even during moments of corporate warfare, and answered with a casual hello, Andrew. That probably sounded way too relaxed for someone whose former company was currently having a very public meltdown. Adrian, he said, and his voice had that particular quality that lawyers get when they're trying very hard to sound professional and calm, but are actually internally freaking out. Like he'd just discovered that the Titanic was sinking and he was the guy responsible for explaining it to the passengers. What's happening? The entire board is calling me. Gerald is calling me. Investors are calling me, and nobody can access anything. The system is completely locked down, and every attempt to override it is being rejected. We have payments that need to go out, contracts that need to be signed, and Atlas is treating every single login attempt like it's a cyber attack. I took a sip of my coffee, let him stew in that panic for just a moment longer than was probably polite, and then said with the kind of calm that only comes when you've planned something down to the last detail and watched it unfold exactly as you predicted. Check Section 4B of the founder's documents. Then I hung up, just clicked the end call button, and set my phone down on the table like I'd just finished the world's most boring conversation about what to have for lunch. Not a conversation that was about to blow apart Gerald's entire understanding of who actually owned the company he thought was his personal playground. The founder's documents, for anyone who doesn't spend their free time reading corporate governance paperwork like it's a thrilling mystery novel, were the original agreements that Gerald's father, the actual founder of Cobecale Energy, had put in place when he established the company back in the 1980s. These weren't the sanitized, simplified versions that got presented to new board members or included in the annual reports. These were the real, complete, full of legal landmines documents that outlined exactly how the company was supposed to be run and what happened if people violated those rules. Section 4B, specifically, was a beautiful piece of legal engineering that Gerald's father had included because, and I'm just speculating here based on 17 years of watching Family Dynamics, he didn't entirely trust his son to run the company without adult supervision. It stated, in very clear legal language that even lawyers couldn't misinterpret no matter how hard they tried, that if the company ever fired its chief systems architect, the person responsible for building and maintaining the core operational infrastructure, without a proper two-thirds supermajority vote of the board of directors following all appropriate corporate governance procedures, the termination would be considered invalid and potentially hostile. But here's where it got really interesting, where the founder's paranoia and my own planning had intersected in the most beautiful way possible. The document went on to specify that in the event of such an invalid termination, ownership of the company's controlling shares, the ones held in the Kobe family trust, would automatically transfer to a protection trust established for the architect's benefit until such time as the board could demonstrate proper governance procedures had been followed. It was basically a dead man's switch built into the corporate structure, a fail-safe designed to prevent exactly the kind of impulsive, ego-driven decision-making that Gerald specialized in. The beauty of the Covenant Protocol was its simplicity, the way it connected the technical infrastructure with the legal framework in a way that nobody had anticipated because they'd never bothered to read both sets of documents carefully enough to see how they fit together. When Atlas detected my unauthorized termination, it didn't just lock down the systems for security purposes, it also automatically triggered the legal provisions in Section 4B by sending certified notifications to the trust's legal custodians, which happened to be Sterling and Pierce, Andrew's firm. By noon, and I know this because Leo was still texting me updates like he was providing live commentary on the world's best sporting event. Every legal team in the building was trying to figure out how their CEO had just been legally outplayed by his son-in-law, who was currently sitting at home in sweatpants eating leftover pancakes and looking entirely too pleased with himself. The conference rooms were full of lawyers, actual rooms full of people in suits who charged hundreds of dollars per hour, all frantically reading through documents that some of them were seeing for the first time despite having been on retainer for years. Andrew called back 17 minutes later, which I knew because I'd been watching the clock and wondering how long it would take him to find Section 4B, read it, understand it, confirm it with his partners, have a minor panic attack, and then call me back. Adrian, he said, And this time his voice had shifted from panic to that special tone lawyers use when they've realized they're dealing with someone who knows exactly what they're doing and has somehow managed to be technically legal while still being completely devastating. We need to talk about this. The provisions in Section 4B they're very clear, but surely we can come to some kind of arrangement. What kind of arrangement? I asked, still sipping my coffee, still sitting at my kitchen table, still wearing sweatpants that had a small syrup stain on them from breakfast that I hadn't bothered to clean up, because honestly, who was I trying to impress? An arrangement where Gerald admits he violated corporate governance procedures and illegally terminated me? An arrangement where the board acknowledges that they allowed the CEO to act unilaterally without proper oversight? Or an arrangement where everyone just pretends this didn't happen and hopes the problem goes away? There was a long silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that meant Andrew was conferring with other people in the room, probably a whole crowd of partners and associates all listening on speakerphone and trying to figure out if there was any legal loophole they could exploit, any technicality they could use to avoid the obvious conclusion that Gerald had screwed up so badly that he'd accidentally handed control of his own company to the guy he'd just fired. The trust provisions are very specific, Andrew finally said, choosing his words carefully like he was defusing a bomb made of legal terminology. If what the system is claiming is accurate, and if the termination wasn't properly authorized, then technically, according to the founder's documents, the controlling shares would transfer to your protective trust until proper procedures are followed. But Adrian, this could destroy the company. The stock is already down 18%, trading is halted, and if this gets out, if investors find out that there's a legal battle over ownership, it could trigger a complete collapse. Then I guess, I said, finishing my coffee and setting the mug down with a gentle click that somehow felt more dramatic than it should have. Gerald should have followed proper procedures before firing me. He should have called a board meeting, presented his case, allowed for discussion and debate, and held a proper vote like the founder's documents required. Instead, he threw my report in the trash and called security because his ego couldn't handle someone telling him he was wrong. That's not my problem, Andrew. That's his problem. And now it's yours. I could hear muffled arguing in the background, multiple voices trying to figure out what to do, how to handle this, whether they should try to negotiate or lawyer their way out of it, or just accept that sometimes people create consequences for themselves that no amount of expensive legal representation can fix. What do you want? Andrew finally asked, and I could hear the exhaustion in his voice, the sound of a man who'd just realized his entire day, week, possibly month was going to be consumed by this disaster. What do I want? I repeated, pretending to think about it, even though I'd known exactly what I wanted since the moment Gerald threw my report away. I want proper corporate governance. I want a board that actually reads the documents they're supposed to be overseeing. I want a CEO who understands that you can't just fire people because they hurt your feelings. And I want Gerald to understand that rocket ships don't fly on buzzwords and motivational speeches. They fly on engineering and people who actually know what they're doing. I hung up before he could respond, because sometimes the best way to end a conversation is to not let the other person have the last word, and also because I needed to use the bathroom, and this seemed like a natural stopping point. As I walked away from my kitchen table, leaving my phone buzzing with incoming calls that I had no intention of answering, I smiled to myself and thought about how Gerald's father, a man I'd only met a few times before he passed away, had somehow known that his son would need protection from himself, had built in safeguards that would outlive him and activate at exactly the right moment to save the company from Gerald's worst impulses. The old man had been smarter than anyone gave him credit for, and right now, from W. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, right W ass off. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, right when I was settling into my couch with a book I'd been meaning to read for about 6 months, one of those thick literary novels that people buy to look smart but never actually finish because life gets in the way, my doorbell rang with the kind of aggressive, repeated pressing that suggested whoever was on the other side had completely abandoned the concept of patience and was operating on pure adrenaline and rage. I knew exactly who it was before I even got up from the couch, before I marked my page and set the book down, before I walked across my living room floor in my socks, because I'd kicked off my shoes earlier and saw no reason to put them back on for this particular visitor. Gerald stood there on my front porch, drenched from the rain that had started about an hour ago, One of those sudden autumn downpours that comes out of nowhere and makes everyone regret not checking the weather forecast. His $8,000 suit, the one he'd probably had custom-made in Italy by some tailor whose waiting list was longer than most people's mortgage terms, was clinging to him like plastic wrap, soaked through and probably ruined beyond repair, which gave me a small spark of joy that I'm not particularly proud of, but also not ashamed enough to feel bad about. His hair, usually perfectly styled with whatever expensive product made it look like he'd just stepped out of a boardroom photo shoot, was plastered to his forehead in sad, wet strands that made him look less like a powerful CEO and more like a drowned cat who'd had a very bad day. He didn't wait for me to invite him in, didn't bother with pleasantries or social niceties or any of the normal conventions of human interaction. He just shoved past me the moment I opened the door, leaving wet footprints on my hardwood floor that Melissa was definitely going to complain about later, and started yelling before he'd even made it fully into the living room. "What did you do, Adrian?" His voice was so loud that I genuinely worried about the neighbors hearing, not because I cared what they thought, but because I didn't want to deal with noise complaints on top of everything else. "The company's locked down. Everything is frozen. Do you have any idea what you've done?" I closed the front door calmly, took a moment to appreciate the contrast between his chaotic energy and my complete serenity, and walked past him to the kitchen to get myself a glass of water because all this drama was making me thirsty. "Sounds like a software issue," I said, my voice deliberately casual, the tone you'd use to discuss the weather or what you had for lunch, not the complete meltdown of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. "You should call IT. "Oh wait, you can't log in to do that, can you? That's unfortunate." His face went through several interesting color changes, starting at normal human skin tone, moving through various shades of red, and ending somewhere in the purple family that suggested his blood pressure had reached levels that would concern any reasonable doctor. He followed me into the kitchen, leaving a trail of water droplets like some kind of angry, corporate Hansel and Gretel, and slammed his fist down on my dining table with enough force that my favorite spoon, the one I'd been using earlier for my yogurt, actually jumped into the air and did a little flip before landing on the floor with a clatter that seemed inappropriately cheerful for the mood of the conversation. "This isn't funny, Adrian," he shouted, and I noticed that little vein in his forehead was throbbing, the one that always appeared during particularly stressful board meetings or when someone challenged his ideas with actual facts and data. "The stock is in free fall. We have billions of dollars in transactions that can't process. Payroll is frozen. Do you understand what that means? People won't get paid. Vendors won't get paid. We have contracts that are going to default because we can't access the system to execute them." I picked up my spoon from the floor, rinsed it off in the sink because I'm not a savage, and then turned to face him with the kind of calm that I knew would infuriate him even more than yelling would. "Gee, Gerald, that sounds really serious. Almost like you should have thought about these consequences before you fired the person who built the system that manages all of those things. Almost like you should have followed proper corporate governance procedures instead of having a temper tantrum and calling security. But hey, what do I know? I'm just the paranoid anchor who got thrown away like trash, remember?" He opened his mouth to respond, probably to launch into another tirade about how this was all my fault and I was being unreasonable and didn't I care about the innocent employees who would be affected by this. But I wasn't done yet, and I'd been waiting 17 years to say some of this stuff out loud. "You want to know what I did, Gerald? I'll tell you exactly what I did. I built a system with fail-safes, because that's what good engineers do. I built protections into the company's infrastructure because I understood, even if you didn't, that sometimes people make stupid decisions, and the system needs to protect itself from those decisions. Your father understood this too, by the way. He's the one who wrote Section 4B into the founder's documents." I walked over to where my laptop was sitting on the dining room table, opened it up, and pulled up the document that I'd bookmarked weeks ago, knowing this moment would eventually come. The screen showed the covenant document, the founder's original incorporation papers and trust agreements, all the legal framework that Gerald had apparently never bothered to read despite being the CEO of the company his father had built. "This right here," I said, turning the laptop so he could see it. "This is what your father signed 37 years ago when he founded the company. See that signature? That's his. See that date? That's 1988, before you even joined the company, Back when your father still had hopes that maybe you'd turn out to be someone who actually understood business instead of just being good at looking important in photographs. Gerald's face, which I didn't think could get any more colorful, somehow managed to find a new shade that existed somewhere between purple and what I can only describe as expired shrimp. He leaned over the laptop, his wet hair dripping onto my keyboard, which was extremely annoying, but I let it slide because this moment was too good to interrupt with complaints about water damage and read the section I'd highlighted for him. I watched his eyes move across the screen, watched the exact moment when the words penetrated his skull and he understood what had happened, what his father had done, what I had activated. "This is fraud," he shouted, backing away from the laptop like it had personally insulted him, his voice cracking slightly, which would have been sad if he wasn't such an insufferable human being. "This is manipulation. This is some kind of technicality that doesn't count. You can't just take over a company because of some obscure clause in a document nobody's looked at in decades." "No," I said, and my voice was still calm, but there was steel underneath it now, the kind of tone that made it clear I was done playing nice, done being polite, done pretending that any of this was anything other than exactly what it looked like. This is backup planning. This is what happens when a smart man who built something from nothing understands that his son might not be capable of protecting that legacy. Your father believed in succession planning, in corporate governance, in having systems in place to prevent disasters. You believed in slogans and rocket ship metaphors and firing people who told you things you didn't want to hear. Gerald stood there, trembling now, not from the cold of his wet clothes, but from rage and shock and the dawning realization that he'd been completely, utterly, devastatingly outmaneuvered by the son-in-law he'd never taken seriously, the tech guy he thought was just there to keep the computers running while the real business happened elsewhere. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, and for a moment I genuinely wondered if he was going to try to hit me, which would have been interesting because I'm pretty sure assault charges on top of everything else would have been the perfect cherry on top of this disaster sundae he'd created for himself. "You," he said, his voice low and shaking, pointing one finger at me like he was cursing me in some kind of corporate voodoo ritual. "You have destroyed everything. My company, my reputation, my family. Melissa will never forgive you for this. You've ruined your own marriage over some petty revenge scheme because your feelings got hurt." I laughed, actually laughed out loud, because the audacity of this man to play the victim after everything he'd done was so absurd it bordered on comedic genius. "My feelings got hurt. Gerald, you threw away a 50-page risk analysis like it was junk mail. You called me paranoid for doing my job. You fired me without following any proper procedures because your ego couldn't handle being wrong. And now you're standing in my house, dripping water all over my floor, yelling at me about revenge? This isn't revenge. This is consequences. There's a difference, and the fact that you can't tell them apart is exactly why your father wrote that clause in the first place." He left then, storming out of my house without another word, slamming the door so hard that a picture frame on the wall rattled and nearly fell off its hook. Through the window, I watched him stumble to his car, get in, sit there for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel, and I swear I could see his shoulders shaking like he was either crying or laughing or having some kind of breakdown that combined elements of both. Then he started the engine and drove away, leaving tire marks on my driveway that would probably never come out and would forever be a reminder of this perfect, terrible, absolutely justified day. I closed the door, locked it for good measure because who knew if he'd come back with reinforcements or lawyers or both, and walked back to my couch where my book was waiting patiently. As I picked it up and found my page again, I whispered to the empty room, to the silence that felt more peaceful than it had in years. "Good idea, Gerald. Bring lots of lawyers. You're going to need them." Then I smiled, settled back into the cushions, and continued reading my book like I hadn't just watched a man's entire world crumble in my living room while he dripped expensive rainwater all over my hardwood floors. 2 days later, after 72 hours of absolute chaos that I watched unfold from the comfort of my home, like it was the world's best reality TV show, I returned to the 48th floor of the Cobekale Energy Building, not as the fired employee who'd been escorted out by security guards who looked more uncomfortable than I did, not as the paranoid anchor who'd been thrown away like yesterday's garbage, but as the new majority shareholder with controlling interest in the company and the legal authority to do pretty much whatever I wanted within the bounds of corporate governance and common sense. The elevator ride up was surreal in the best possible way. That particular kind of surreal that comes when you're living through something you'd fantasized about, but never quite believed would actually happen. The same elevator I'd ridden thousands of times over 17 years, the same music playing overhead, the same slightly too bright LED lights that made everyone look vaguely jaundiced. But this time, everything felt different because I wasn't going up to beg for my job back or negotiate some kind of settlement. I was going up to take over, and the difference between those two scenarios was absolutely delicious. The guards who had literally, physically escorted me out of the building just days ago, one on each arm like I was some kind of corporate criminal being perp-walked to my execution, now stood at attention and held the glass doors open for me with the kind of respect that comes from suddenly realizing the person you manhandled is now technically your boss. They didn't say anything. Probably had been explicitly instructed not to say anything by someone in HR who was desperately trying to avoid any additional lawsuits or embarrassing incidents. But their eyes told the whole story. Confusion, embarrassment, maybe a little fear about whether I was the kind of person who held grudges against security guards who were just doing their jobs. I nodded at them politely as I walked through, because I'm not a monster who punishes people for following orders, and made my way down the hallway toward the main conference room where the emergency board meeting had been called. My footsteps echoed on the polished marble floors, that same expensive flooring that Gerald had insisted on installing 5 years ago, because apparently regular floors weren't impressive enough for his vision of corporate greatness. And I took a moment to appreciate the irony that I was walking across his precious marble to take control of his precious company. The conference room doors were already open, and I could see them all sitting there around that massive table that probably cost more than most people's cars, looking like students waiting for the principal to arrive and deliver bad news about their test scores or behavior reports. Gerald sat at the far end of the table, as far away from the door as physically possible, pale and sweating despite the aggressive air conditioning that kept the room at a temperature somewhere between uncomfortably cold and commercial refrigerator. His suit was different from the one he'd ruined in the rain at my house, but he wore it with none of his usual confidence, slumped in his chair like someone had removed his spine and forgotten to put it back. The other board members, those titans of industry who'd rubber-stamped every one of Gerald's idiotic ideas for years without bothering to ask basic questions like, "Is this legal?" or "Does this make any sense?" were suddenly experts in sitting very still and avoiding eye contact. They nodded respectfully as I walked in, some of them actually standing up like I was royalty or the president or someone who deserved that level of deference, which I absolutely did after everything they'd put me through by enabling Gerald's incompetence. I took my seat at the head of the table, the spot where Gerald usually sat when he was running these meetings, and I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel incredibly good to watch him sit there at the opposite end, displaced, defeated, looking like a man who'd just realized that everything he thought he knew about his life was actually built on foundations he'd never bothered to inspect. I opened my laptop, the same one I'd shown him the founder's documents on just days ago, and pulled up Atlas, which now recognized me as the primary administrator again and displayed all its beautiful data across my screen in perfect, orderly rows. "Gentlemen," I said, and my voice was calm and professional and carried just enough authority to make it clear that we were doing things my way now. First order of business. We need to conduct a full forensic audit of every contract signed during Mr. Kale's tenure as CEO, particularly over the last 3 years when he decided that corporate governance was more of a suggestion than a requirement. We need to examine every major decision, every financial transaction, every vendor relationship, and every consulting agreement to ensure that everything was above board and in the company's best interests. I pressed a button on my laptop and Atlas sprang to life on the conference room's main display screen, that enormous monitor that took up most of the wall and usually showed PowerPoint presentations full of rocket ships and motivational quotes. Instead of Gerald's usual slideshow of nonsense, Atlas projected graphs, spreadsheets, data visualizations, shell accounts that I'd flagged weeks ago, fake consultancy payments to companies that didn't seem to exist, wire transfers to offshore accounts that had no clear business purpose. All of it laid out in beautiful, damning detail faster than Gerald could blink or formulate a defense or do anything except sit there and watch his sins displayed in high definition for everyone to see. The room went silent, that particular kind of silence that happens when people are seeing something they can't unsee, when the truth becomes so obvious that denial is no longer an option. I watched their faces as they processed the information, watched several board members lean forward to get a better look at the numbers, watched one of them actually gasp when he saw the total amount of money that had been funneled through questionable channels, watched Gerald sink lower in his chair like he was trying to disappear into the leather upholstery. As you can see, I continued, my voice still perfectly level, still professional, but with an edge that suggested I was enjoying this more than was probably appropriate for a serious business meeting. There are some significant irregularities that need to be addressed. Consulting fees paid to companies that share addresses with personal properties owned by Mr. Kale's friends. Vendor contracts awarded without proper bidding processes to companies that seem to have no employees or infrastructure. Wire transfers labeled as operational expenses that went to accounts in the Cayman Islands and then promptly disappeared into the financial ether. I didn't need to raise my voice, didn't need to dramatically point fingers or make accusations like some kind of courtroom lawyer in a TV drama. I just let Atlas do the talking, let the data speak for itself, let the numbers and the transactions and the patterns tell the story that was so obvious once you actually bothered to look at it instead of accepting Gerald's explanations at face value. The company he'd claimed to be steering toward greatness, his precious rocket ship, had actually been fueling a few private jets for his friends, financing their lifestyles, paying for God knows what while he stood in front of investors and talked about synergy and disruption and all those other buzzwords that meant absolutely nothing. One of the board members, Thompson, I think his name was, an older guy who'd been with the company since Gerald's father was still alive and probably should have spoken up years ago, but had been too comfortable collecting his board member fees to rock the boat, cleared his throat and asked in a shaky voice, "How long has this been going on? How much are we talking about total?" I pulled up another screen, this one showing a timeline that stretched back nearly 5 years, with the frequency and amounts of suspicious transactions increasing dramatically over the last 18 months as Gerald had apparently gotten more confident that nobody was paying attention or that he was too important to question. Conservatively, I said, letting that word hang in the air for a moment. We're looking at somewhere between $47 and $63 million in questionable transactions, possibly more depending on what the forensic accountants find when they dig deeper into the offshore accounts and shell companies. That's not pocket change, gentlemen. That's not a rounding error. That's systematic fraud that's been happening right under your noses while you all nodded along and approved budgets without reading them. Gerald finally found his voice, though it came out strangled and desperate, nothing like his usual confident CEO tone that he used when he was bullshitting his way through investor calls. This is taken out of context. Those were legitimate business expenses. Those consulting companies provided valuable services. You can't just throw around accusations like this without understanding the full picture. I turned to look at him, really look at him, and felt absolutely nothing except maybe a vague sense of pity for someone so delusional that even with the evidence literally projected on a wall in front of him, he still thought he could talk his way out of it. Then explain it to us, Gerald. Explain why you paid $3 million to a consulting company that's registered at your golf buddy's lake house. Explain why you approved bonuses for executives who didn't meet their performance targets while cutting benefits for frontline employees who actually did the work. Explain why you fired your chief systems architect without a proper board vote, violating both corporate governance procedures and your own father's explicit instructions about succession planning. He had no explanation, at least not one that made any sense or would hold up to any kind of scrutiny, and we all knew it. The board members were looking at each other now, having silent conversations with their eyes, the kind of nonverbal communication that happens when people are trying to figure out how to distance themselves from a disaster without looking like they'd been complicit in it, even though they absolutely had been through their negligence and their willingness to let Gerald do whatever he wanted as long as the stock price was going up. I closed my laptop with a gentle click that somehow felt more final than if I'd slammed it shut, and leaned back in my chair with the satisfaction of someone who'd just won a game they'd been playing for 17 years. I think we all know what needs to happen here. The question is whether we do it cleanly and professionally, or whether we drag this out, and let the media and the prosecutors have a field day with all of this. Your choice, gentlemen, but I'd recommend the former because the latter is going to be extremely expensive and extremely public, and I don't think any of us want that. Within a week, and I'm talking about 7 calendar days that probably felt like 7 years to Gerald as he watched his empire crumble around him in slow motion, like a building being demolished floor by floor, the board voted him out for cause. Not a resignation, not a mutual parting of ways, not one of those gentle pursuing other opportunities press releases that companies put out when they want to pretend a firing was actually a friendly decision made by adults who respect each other. No, this was a full, official, documented in the corporate records termination for cause, complete with findings of financial impropriety, violation of fiduciary duty, breach of corporate governance procedures, and basically every other corporate law violation short of actual criminal charges. Though honestly those might be coming too, depending on what the forensic accountants found when they really dug into those offshore accounts. The vote was unanimous, which would have been funny if it wasn't so predictable. Watching all those board members who'd spent years enabling Gerald's worst impulses suddenly trip over themselves to distance themselves from him like he'd developed a contagious disease. They voted to remove him, voted to approve the forensic audit, voted to cooperate fully with any regulatory investigations, voted to implement new oversight procedures, voted on basically everything I suggested because they were terrified that if they didn't, they'd be next on the chopping block. And honestly, they weren't wrong to be scared because some of them absolutely deserved to lose their cushy board positions for their years of negligent rubber stamping. There was no golden parachute, no massive severance package, no 7-figure payout for his years of service that would let him retire comfortably to some private island where disgraced CEOs go to write books about leadership and give TED Talks about resilience. The founders' documents and the corporate bylaws were very clear about what happened when a CEO was terminated for cause. They got exactly what their employment contracts specified for misconduct, which in Gerald's case was basically nothing except whatever he'd already earned up to the termination date. And even that was being held pending the results of the investigation because there was a very real possibility he'd have to pay some of it back if they found evidence of actual theft rather than just spectacularly bad judgment. There was no handshake, no farewell party, no gathering of employees to thank him for his years of service and wish him well in his future endeavors. Just a slow, painful, utterly humiliating walk to the elevator on a Thursday afternoon while the company he once ruled, the kingdom he thought he'd inherited by divine right just for being his father's son, moved on without him like he'd never existed. I wasn't there to watch it personally because I had actual work to do, actual problems to solve, actual messes to clean up that Gerald had left behind. But Leo sent me a video that someone had surreptitiously recorded on their phone, shaky footage of Gerald carrying a small cardboard box, the universal symbol of corporate defeat. While employees who used to laugh at his jokes and applaud his presentations suddenly became very interested in their computer screens and pretended not to notice him. Walking by, the box probably contained some personal items from his office, maybe some photos of his family back when they still liked him, maybe some awards and plaques celebrating achievements that now seemed hollow and meaningless. Maybe that stupid motivational poster about rocket ships that had been hanging behind his desk for years. Whatever was in that box, it represented 17 years of accumulated corporate presence being reduced to something you could carry with one hand. And there was something profoundly sad about it, even though Gerald absolutely deserved every ounce of humiliation he was experiencing. Melissa filed for divorce shortly after. Not immediately because I think she needed a few days to process what had happened and maybe secretly hoped that somehow this was all a bad dream or a misunderstanding that could be fixed with enough lawyers and family meetings. But once it became clear that Gerald wasn't coming back, that his reputation was destroyed, that the family legacy her grandfather had built was now in the hands of the son-in-law who'd orchestrated her father's downfall, she made her decision. She hired one of those aggressive divorce attorneys who specialize in high-net-worth cases, the kind who send letters with phrases like irreconcilable differences and division of marital assets, and make everything sound clinical and businesslike instead of emotional and messy, even though emotions and mess were exactly what our marriage had become. I got served with papers at the office, which felt appropriately dramatic, a guy in a cheap suit walking into my new corner office that used to be Gerald's office and handing me an envelope, while saying Adrian Holt, like there was any doubt about who I was sitting in the CEO's chair. I told her, and I tried to keep my voice gentle even though I was exhausted from 16-hour days trying to fix the mess Gerald had left behind. Technically, your family destroyed themselves. I just provided the PowerPoint presentation that made it obvious to everyone else what had been happening for years. Your father violated corporate law, Melissa. He stole from the company. He fired me illegally because his ego couldn't handle being told he was wrong. None of that is my fault. I didn't make him do those things. I just refused to cover for him anymore. She didn't laugh, but I did, not because it was funny, but because sometimes when things get absurd enough, when the gap between how someone sees reality and what reality actually is becomes too wide to bridge with words, laughter is the only response that makes sense. She hung up on me before I could say anything else, and I sat there in my office, in Gerald's old office with his old view of the city that was now my view, and felt the weight of everything that had happened settle on my shoulders like a heavy coat I couldn't take off. The divorce proceedings were surprisingly quick and relatively painless as far as divorces go, probably because neither of us wanted to drag it out and make it worse than it already was. Probably because Melissa wanted to get as far away from me as possible and start rebuilding her life away from the wreckage of her father's career. Probably because both of our lawyers were competent professionals who understood that fighting over every piece of furniture and every shared asset would just make everyone miserable and burn through money that could be better spent on therapy or moving expenses or literally anything else. We split our assets according to the prenuptial agreement that her father had ironically insisted we sign before we got married, back when he was worried that I might divorce his daughter and take half her trust fund, never imagining that the prenup would actually protect me when she divorced me for taking down her father's corrupt empire. She got the house that her father had helped us buy, which felt appropriate since it had always felt more like his house than ours anyway, filled with furniture and art and expensive things that he'd chosen or approved of. I got my freedom, my professional reputation restored, and control of a company that I actually understood how to run, which seemed like a fair trade even if it meant sleeping in a service department for a few months while I figured out my personal life. Sometimes karma doesn't need a hammer, doesn't need dramatic confrontations or violent revenge or any of the theatrical justice that people fantasize about when they've been wronged. Sometimes karma just needs good code, solid planning, and the patience to let people create their own consequences through their own actions. Gerald had built the trap himself with years of bad decisions and illegal behavior, and I'd just been the person who pointed out that the trap existed and maybe everyone should be concerned about that before it was too late. Except it was already too late, had been too late probably years ago, and all I'd done was make the inevitable happen a little faster and a little more publicly than it might have otherwise. The media had a field day with the story, of course, because disgraced CEOs are basically catnip for business journalists who spend most of their time writing boring articles about quarterly earnings and market trends. Energy giant CEO ousted in corporate coup, read one headline, which wasn't exactly accurate since it was less a coup and more a legally mandated consequence of his own actions. But accuracy has never been journalism's strong suit when they can go with something more dramatic. Son-in-law takes down father-in-law's empire, read another. Accompanied by unflattering photos of both of us that they'd clearly chosen specifically to make us look as sketchy as possible. Gerald looking red-faced and angry in some shareholder meeting. Me looking too serious and vaguely sinister in my employee ID photo. There were think pieces about corporate governance, about the dangers of family businesses and nepotism, about the importance of checks and balances and independent boards, about everything except the simple truth that Gerald had been a mediocre executive who'd inherited a company his father built and had slowly destroyed it through a combination of ego, incompetence, and outright theft. But the media loved the David versus Goliath narrative, loved the idea of the overlooked tech genius bringing down the powerful CEO, loved the irony of the son-in-law using the father-in-law's own father's legal documents to take control. So I let them tell whatever story they wanted because the truth was documented in court filings and corporate records for anyone who actually cared to look. Within 3 weeks of Gerald's departure, the company's stock had stabilized and actually started recovering as investors realized that the leadership change might actually be good for business, that having someone who understood how the company actually worked might be preferable to having someone who just looked good in suits and gave inspiring speeches. Atlas was running smoothly again. All the frozen transactions had been processed, payroll had gone through without a hitch, vendors had been paid, and the existential crisis that had gripped the company for those chaotic few days had passed like a fever breaking. I spent my evenings alone in my temporary apartment, eating takeout and reading through years of corporate documents that Gerald had never bothered to understand, finding more problems that needed fixing, more decisions that needed reversing, more messes that needed cleaning up. It wasn't glamorous work, wasn't the exciting revenge fantasy that people probably imagined, was just the slow, tedious process of rebuilding systems and restoring trust and making sure that the company Gerald's father had founded would survive Gerald's attempt to destroy it through negligence and greed. My first day as CEO, officially as CEO with business cards and an email signature that said Chief Executive Officer instead of Lead Systems Architect, felt poetic in a way that I hadn't quite anticipated when I was planning all of this from my study at 2 in the morning with my encrypted tablet and my fancy tea. It was one of those crystalline autumn mornings where the air feels sharp and clean, where the sunlight hits the buildings at just the right angle to make the whole city look like it's been dipped in gold, where everything feels possible and new even though most of what I was doing was actually very old, just returning things to the way they should have been all along before Gerald spent years screwing them up. I arrived early, before most of the employees, before the morning rush of people flooding into the lobby with their coffee cups and their Monday morning expressions, before the elevators filled up with small talk and awkward silences. I wanted to experience this moment alone, wanted to walk through the building without an audience, wanted to feel what it was like to be the person responsible for all of this, for the thousands of employees whose paychecks depended on my decisions, for the shareholders who were cautiously optimistic that maybe this disaster could be turned into something resembling success, for the legacy of Gerald's father who'd built something meaningful and deserved better than watching his son run it into the ground. The same office, Gerald's old corner office that was now my corner office, felt different somehow, even though nothing had physically changed except the name plate outside the door and the fact that I'd had them remove all of Gerald's motivational posters and replace them with exactly nothing because blank walls felt more honest than fake inspiration. The same massive desk made of some endangered wood that probably shouldn't have been made into furniture, the same ergonomic chair that cost more than most people's monthly rent, the same view of the skyline that stretched out for miles in every direction, tall buildings and cranes and construction sites, and the endless busy chaos of a city that never stopped moving or building or destroying and rebuilding itself. But this time, sitting in that chair, looking at that view, I wasn't the fired employee being escorted out by security guards who couldn't make eye contact. I wasn't the paranoid anchor whose reports got thrown in the trash like junk mail. I wasn't the son-in-law who was tolerated because he was married to the boss's daughter and was good with computers, but wasn't really important to the actual business of business. I was the CEO, the person at the top of the organizational chart, the one whose decisions would ripple down through every department and affect every person who worked here, and nobody, absolutely nobody, dared call me an anchor anymore because they'd all seen what happened to the last person who'd underestimated me. Only this time, I wasn't there to prove a point or settle a score or show everyone how smart I was. I was there to actually do the job, to fix the problems, to build something that would last beyond my ego or Gerald's ego or anyone else's ego. The revenge part was over, had been satisfying while it lasted, but was ultimately just the opening act. Now came the hard part, the part that didn't make for good dramatic stories or sensational headlines, the part where I had to actually prove that I wasn't just good at tearing things down, but could also build them back up. One of my first official acts as CEO, and I'd been planning this particular move since before I even activated the Covenant Protocol, because symbolism matters even in business, was to rename the main conference room. The one where Gerald had thrown away my report, where he'd called me paranoid, where the board had enabled his worst impulses for years, where I'd eventually returned to show them all the evidence of his fraud. That room needed a new identity, needed to represent what the company should be rather than what it had become under Gerald's leadership. I renamed it the Founder's Room, a tribute to Gerald's father who'd understood that businesses need integrity more than they need charisma, who'd built protections into his corporate documents because he knew that good intentions weren't enough without good systems to enforce them, who'd trusted me enough to include provisions that would eventually save the company from his own son's incompetence. I installed a bronze plaque outside the door, commissioned from a local artist who specialized in this kind of thing, engraved with words that I'd spent an embarrassing amount of time perfecting because I wanted them to mean something real rather than just being another corporate platitude that people would read once and then ignore forever. The plaque read, "Integrity is the only fuel that keeps a rocket in orbit." It was a deliberate callback to Gerald's favorite metaphor, the rocket ship he'd talked about constantly, the grand vision of launching the company into space or success or whatever destination he'd imagined in his motivational slideshow fantasies. But where Gerald had focused on the launch, on the excitement and the spectacle and the inspiring imagery of rockets blasting off toward the stars, he'd completely missed the point that rockets need constant fuel to stay in orbit, that maintaining altitude is harder than achieving it, that integrity isn't something you can fake or shortcut or replace with buzzwords and enthusiasm. The plaque was unveiled on a Friday afternoon, nothing fancy or ceremonial, just me and a small group of employees who'd been with the company long enough to remember when Gerald's father was alive and to appreciate what the gesture meant. A few of them got emotional, which I hadn't expected but probably should have. Older workers who'd seen the company change over the years and had worried that the founder's values had been lost somewhere along the way. One guy, must have been in his 60s, came up to me after and shook my hand with both of his, looked me in the eye with the kind of intensity that suggested he was trying not to cry, and said, "Thank you for bringing us back." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and hoped it was enough. Then, after the small crowd dispersed and went back to their desks and their work and their regular Friday afternoon countdown to the weekend, I did something I hadn't done in years, something I'd been too busy or too stressed or too focused on survival to do. I went back to my office, closed the door, sat down at my desk, pulled out my old briefcase that I'd carried for 17 years through every meeting and every crisis and every small victory, and I brewed my tea. Not office kitchen tea, not the sad tea bags that taste like paper and regret, but my actual good tea, the Darjeeling silver leaf that I'd started bringing from home, because some things are too important to compromise on even in the middle of corporate warfare. The electric kettle I'd brought and sat on the credenza, completely out of place among the expensive office furniture and the serious business equipment. But I didn't care because this was my office now, and if I wanted to brew tea like a civilized human being instead of drinking the burned coffee that most executives seem to survive on, that was my prerogative as CEO. The water heated, the tea steeped, and I poured myself a cup in the same mug I'd been using for years, slightly chipped around the rim from that time I dropped it in the parking lot, but still functional, still mine, still a reminder that you don't need expensive things to have meaningful experiences. I sat there with my tea, the steam rising in delicate spirals, and whispered to the empty office, to Atlas somewhere in the digital infrastructure humming away in the server rooms, to myself, and to whatever part of Gerald's father's spirit might still be hanging around, making sure his company survived his son's best efforts to destroy it. Well, Atlas, we're back. It felt dramatic and probably a little silly, talking to an AI system like it was a person, like it could hear me or care about my philosophical musings. But after everything we'd been through together, after Atlas had executed the Covenant protocol perfectly and helped expose Gerald's fraud and basically save the company, it felt right to acknowledge the partnership even if I was the only conscious being in the conversation. The screens on my desk lit up in response, not because Atlas had somehow achieved sentience and was responding to my greeting, but because I'd scheduled a system diagnostic to run at this exact time, and it was displaying the results across my monitors. Data flowing perfectly, every system running at optimal efficiency, every department connected and communicating and functioning like a healthy organism instead of the diseased mess it had been a few weeks ago when Gerald's firing had triggered the lockdown. Green indicators everywhere I looked, confirmation that everything was working exactly as designed, that the crisis was over and we could finally focus on actually running a business instead of just surviving. Outside my window, the city glittered in the late afternoon sun, thousands of windows reflecting light, thousands of people in thousands of offices doing their own work and fighting their own battles, and probably never knowing or caring about the corporate drama that had consumed my life for the past few weeks. The buildings reached toward the sky like they were competing to see who could get closest to the clouds. Cranes swinging across construction sites where tomorrow's skyscrapers were being built by people who showed up every day and did the actual work while executives took credit and made speeches. It was beautiful in that impersonal way that cities are beautiful, all that human ambition and effort and struggle compressed into steel and glass and concrete. All those individual stories invisible from up here on the 48th floor. Inside, in my office with my tea and my monitors displaying Atlas's perfect diagnostics, I smiled, not the sarcastic smile I'd been wearing for weeks while watching Gerald's empire crumble, not the satisfied smirk of successful revenge, but something quieter and more genuine, the kind of smile that comes from actually accomplishing something difficult and meaningful. The smile of someone who'd spent 17 years building something important, had watched it almost get destroyed by incompetence and greed, and had somehow managed to save it while also holding people accountable for their actions. They had called me an anchor, had dismissed me as the paranoid tech guy who worried too much and didn't understand the bigger picture, had treated me like I was holding them back from their rocket ship dreams of corporate glory and unlimited growth. But it turned out, and this was the part that still made me laugh when I thought about it too long, it turned out that I wasn't the anchor at all. Anchors hold things down, keep them stuck in one place, prevent movement and progress. What I actually was, what I'd always been even when nobody recognized it or appreciated it, was the engine, the thing that actually made everything work. The component that you can't see from the outside, but without which nothing else functions. Gerald had wanted a rocket ship, had loved the metaphor so much that he'd put it on posters and presentations, and probably would have painted it on the side of the building if the board had let him. But rocket ships are complicated machines, not inspirational concepts. They need engineers who understand physics and fuel consumption and orbital mechanics, not CEOs who give motivational speeches about reaching for the stars. They need people who can do the actual work of keeping systems running, who can spot problems before they become disasters, who can build things that last beyond the initial excitement of the launch. And now, sitting in the CEO's chair with my tea and my monitors, and my renamed conference room with its bronze plaque about integrity, I had the chance to prove that the metaphor could actually work if you had the right person running it. Not someone who talked about rocket ships, but someone who actually understood how to build them and fly them, and keep them in orbit year after year through good times and bad. Tomorrow was going to bring new challenges, new problems to solve, new crises to manage, because that's what running a company means regardless of whether you're doing it well or doing it poorly. There would be difficult decisions about personnel and strategy, uncomfortable conversations about the employees who'd enabled Gerald's behavior and whether they deserved second chances, complex negotiations with regulators who wanted to make sure this kind of fraud didn't happen again. Media interviews where I'd have to talk about corporate governance and accountability without sounding too self-righteous or too bitter about what had happened. But tonight, for this one perfect moment at the end of my first official day as CEO, I just sat in my office and drank my tea and watched the city lights start to come on as the sun set behind the buildings, and I let myself feel satisfied. Not with the revenge, not with taking down Gerald, not with any of that petty personal victory stuff that had motivated me in the beginning. Satisfied with having saved something worth saving. Satisfied with having proven that integrity actually matters, that systems and processes and doing things the right way actually produces better results than charisma and buzzwords and motivational posters. Satisfied with having turned the founder's vision, Gerald's father's original dream of building something meaningful and lasting, back into reality after watching it get corrupted and degraded for years. That felt like an accomplishment worth having, worth all the stress and the dissolved marriage and the uncomfortable conversations and the late nights and the risk of complete failure if the covenant protocol hadn't worked exactly as planned. My phone buzzed with another notification, probably Leo sending me some meme about corporate comebacks or another update about the company's recovering stock price, but I ignored it. Tomorrow I'd be back to responding to every message and managing every crisis and being the responsible CEO who kept everything running smoothly. But tonight, just for tonight, I was going to finish my tea, watch the sunset, and appreciate the fact that sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys win. They'd call me an anchor. Fair enough. But anchors don't just hold things down. They also keep ships from drifting into rocks and sinking to the bottom of the ocean. And it turns out that what this company had actually needed all along wasn't someone to launch it into space, but someone to keep it steady and stable and pointed in the right direction. Someone who understood that real success isn't about how high you fly. It's about whether you can sustain that altitude without crashing. Gerald had wanted to be the pilot of a rocket ship. I was content being the engineer who made sure the engines actually worked. And in the end, that made all the difference.